John's on. Oh, John's.
Welcome to Grail Country. I have three special guests with me today. I have my friend Sam with the Transfigured podcast and YouTube channel. I have Dr. John Vervaeke, cognitive scientist and also YouTube personality. And I have Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood, who is starting to become a new light in our little corner of the internet, kind of making the rounds. He's written a book called The Whole Mystery of Christ, about the theology of Maximus the Confessor. I thought primarily today what we would talk about is participation, but I had an interesting question I kind of wanted to start with rather than diving right into the philosophical question about participation. And Sam's channel name kind of inspired that question. His channel is called Transfigured, and it is a reference to the Transfiguration. So what I wanted to ask is, what kind of knowing is involved in the Transfiguration? Like if we had a video camera at the Transfiguration, like what would the video camera have captured? How is it that the disciples know that it's Moses and Elijah that are there talking with Jesus? And what anyone can open with their thoughts. I'm just opening the question.
I think Sam should go first since he's got the right of title. Yeah,
I've got the right of title to Transfigured. Okay, well, I titled my YouTube channel Transfigured, and you can see this in like sort of my intro video, is that my YouTube channel is trying to see Jesus for who he really is, right? And I think that is fundamentally what's happening at the Transfiguration, is that there is some, I mean, the Gospels have a lot of this idea that you could see Jesus and not see Jesus, right? You could, lots of people interacted with him, lots of people heard him, lots of people saw him, but not everyone truly saw him. And there's this deeper level of truly seeing that I think the Transfiguration is like some sort of weird, it like zaps the apostles, right? It's only three of the apostles that are there, right? It's like Peter, James, and John maybe that are at the Transfiguration, and it causes them to see in the normal way what they should be seeing in the super normal way the whole time, right? And helps them alert to Jesus's deeper than normal identity. But I also don't feel like the Transfiguration is just straight up teaching that Jesus is God, because it's also important that Moses and Elijah are also transfigured at the same time. They have the same glowing appearance that Jesus does. And like Nathan, how do they know that it's Moses and Elijah? I have no idea. That's a perfectly good question. I don't think they were wearing name tags. But it's just, like in a dream, sometimes a character comes in and you just know who it is, right? In this sort of weird identity sense, but you don't have actually the context in your dream to know that. It's just like, I can imagine that the vision that they saw was something like that. But I think, it's weird. Like, was that some sort of out of body vision, or was it some sort of weird, what you can see in a vision breaking into reality in an abnormal way for all three apostles that were beholding at the same time all together? And I think it's something like that the way that we're supposed to normally try and see Jesus, but we struggle to, zapped into like the reality in a unique and transcendent way at the Transfiguration. So that's how I would put it.
So one way into it from my perspective is typically we think of seeing a vision as either imposing a unity on otherwise chaotic phenomena, or right, like whether that's a Platonic version of that, or Aristotelian or Kantian, or if you're just sort of a regular realist about it, it's like this thing is objectively there and you just have some kind of unproblematic access to it. It's unified in itself, right? What I've always thought about the Transfiguration, both as it's presented in the Gospels, but then also in the history of its interpretation, and for me specifically through the Alexandrian tradition, through Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, and Maximus, each of whom, it's interesting to compare their interpretations, which we can get into that if we want. But the transfiguration, the sort of knowing, is the kind of knowing which actually achieves the unity of the vision itself in the act of seeing. So it's neither like a sort of more subjective, like we already have these categories built in which categorize and coherentize phenomena for us, or it's just there's something like a substantial form in the thing itself related to other substantial forms around it, which is already unified out there exterior to us. But and of course, where I want to go, Nate, you won't be surprised, is it's crucial that the one being seen and the one revealing, so that he can be seen as a person, and that person stands at the center of the vision, and yet is relating to every other aspect of the vision and to the seers themselves all at once. It's like this act of unity. And I think that, like, so, and we could run the question is, what is it unifying? You might maybe ask that question, and the answer is sort of everything. if you really get into it, especially the history of interpretation, because on the one hand, like in the text itself, there's a few interesting things to note exegetically, right? One would be, you do have the three disciples there. You do have three revealed: Elijah, Moses, Christ at the center. And it's interesting to me that even as this is clearly an elevated or some sense spiritual or super sensible perception, the first thing Peter thinks is physical. Mm-hmm. Should we build tents? Right? Should we? But you want me to build? Like, it's a very practical reaction to this vision, and so it's almost as if even in that intuition, seeing something elevated not only doesn't negate something that you might consider a mundane, trivial, earthbound thought or line of thinking, but in fact prompts it. I don't know how or why, and I'm not sure I can totally, even guess at that. But so you've got this sort of act of unity in the text itself. Let's think about this ground we're standing on, even as we see the one who is being transfigured and the light of glory is shining through. You also have and this is typically noted, the unity of, you might say, the prophets in Christ, or the law and the prophets in Christ, Elijah standing for prophets, Moses' law, and then that the perhaps symbolically presented to us as, at the end, when they look back at Christ, it is, yes, it was the three who were glorified. Now it is only one, is he who remains. So there's a sort of like relation of unification once again between Christ and law and prophets. And then, so those are in the text, but at least this is the last point I'll make. If I'm thinking later and all the way to Maximus's say Ambiguum 10, just a central text for his treatment of the Transfiguration. And you compare that to like Origen, by whom he's certainly inspired, there's no question. And Origen will do that thing as he does in the commentary in Matthew, where it's like, what does the garments represent of Christ transfigured? Not just who is Christ, not just who's there, not just what is the reaction, but also what are the inner and outer garments, which are themselves illuminated by the person wearing them, and what is the body that is illuminated, right, by the body of Christ. And of course, he's got all kinds of ways he can go from there. Maximus's emphasis later, he also does that. He meditates on each of those aspects. But one of the things he keeps emphasizing is that the garments of Christ are, as he says, like the sensible logi or principles of the cosmos. And also the body of Christ are the intelligible principles or logi, according to which and upon which the cosmos has been created. And so there's the act of unification between what you might say this extremely unique spatio-temporal event as it's presented in Matthew 17, and the entirety of all history and all events, and all, even down to the principles of sensible, intelligible cosmos, which we similarly perceive all the times to various degrees. And that standing at the center of all of it, history, cosmos, particular event, universal eventuation itself, is a person, who himself wears everything about him, and you can speak and meditate about him, but who is, because he's the unifying principle of all of them, you can never specifically speak him, only about him, only around him. So that which unifies is, I think maybe John will like this, the Platonian point, that which unifies is also that which cannot be itself unified in the act of perception or intellection. It's the thing by which you unify. So here it's Christ, I think, at least in Maximus's handling of the Transfiguration. So I'm just emphasizing person as this sort of synthetic dynamism, which is bringing together many different dimensions. That's how I would approach it, perhaps.
You're muted, John. Just FYI.
Thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm going to try and speak here as I've been introduced as a cognitive scientist. I'll probably be the odd person out, but hopefully it'll say stuff that's relevant. I think the way that this image, and that's what it is being taken up is exactly what it is. It's exemplifying how it is being taken up. It is imaginally augmenting your perception and conception. You're seeing through it by means of it and beyond it. And I think that's what kind of event it is. That's exactly what kind of event it is. And that explains the weird transjective nature. They sort of recognize Elijah and Moses, but they've never seen them before. Like, what's going on there? Yet at the same time, it's not, they're giving indication that it's not, just in their head. But Peter's let's build them tents is obviously sort of ridiculous, and it's portrayed that way. So treating it objectively is also sort of being put down. It's this different kind. I think it's a transjective, imaginally augmented, right, perception and conception, and that's what all of you, I hear you doing with it, and I think it's exemplifying exactly how it is being taken up. Now, where I would differ is I see other instances of this kind of thing. Before I practiced Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. While I was practicing Zen, mountains weren't mountains and rivers weren't rivers. And when I was done practicing Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. And you can hear the difference because all of the cosmos is now in the mountain and the rivers, where before they were just mountain and rivers. But that doesn't mean they have stopped being mountains and rivers. You're now seeing them in a transfigured fashion, in a profound way. Or Blake's to see the world in a grain of sand, or Spinoza's Scantia Intuitiva, where you see each thing. You see God in everything and each and everything in God. And that's not a conjecture, that's a realization. So I'm interested in this, and I said from the beginning, my approach is scientific. I want to see, is there a general thing going on here? And can it reveal something about a general capacity? Because the question was a question of knowing. And I'm not trying to be tenacious here. I mean, and I'm not trying to deny something here either, but I'm trying to walk very carefully. I hope you'll accept it that, right? The degree to which something is miraculous is the degree to which I wonder if the word knowing should be applied to it. And so I'm bracketing whether or not there might be something theologically miraculous going on, if that means, sort of Enlightenment style supernatural or something like that. I'm trying to get at, is there something really profound going on here? And do I see it elsewhere? The capacity for transfiguration, and can we understand that as indicating a certain capacity for knowing? And I think one of the things, this is a lot of the work I'm doing on the cognitive science of ritual right now. I think there's good evidence, increasingly so, for imaginally augmented perception and conception, the imaginal as different from the imaginary, and that this can lead to this kind of enhancement of participatory knowing, which I think does align with a lot of what Jordan was saying. Sorry, I keep skipping on Jordan because there's been so many Jordans I've been talking to. Right?
Sorry, yeah, I'm late to the
No,
party.
it's not your fault. It's weird coincidence.
It
now,
is weird.
I know that's not, I'm not playing in exactly the same arena, but I'm here to try and answer the question as deeply and as honestly as I can, in a way that at least provides for dialogue. So I see this as pointing to the kind of knowing in which there's imaginally augmented perspectival and participatory knowing that brings about a potential transformation in a human being's sense of identity, both their identity in themselves and their identity in the world. That would be my answer.
And I think it's interesting that just if I may, it's interesting that the way that, say, like Maximus handles this text would really be consonant with what you're saying, John, because
Yes.
because he immediately says, in fact, this is an insight not simply into an event, like a miraculous, unique event. And in fact, somehow it's revealing the very structure of everything.
Yeah.
Right. So why contemplate the principles of the universe according to which sensible and intelligible have made, and somehow what's being revealed are the principles. The Logos himself is the person who in him, as he says in another text, he says he brought along with him all of the natural logi, the principles of all the world, right? And so again, even the very distinction between a particular event and the universal event, you might say, of eventuation itself, the possibility of event itself, is already, it's interesting to me that Maximus already wants to, in that tradition, wants to go that direction as well. Like, far from this being an exclusive attestation to the unique miraculous or of aura or glory revealed here, as if it's a mere exception to everything else, which is more or less banal. He somehow sees this as the heart of everything, always, everywhere, right? So just agreeing with you, I think, from that perspective.
Yeah, I have been reading your book, and I'm interested in this argument in general. And I have been making my way through the Ambigua, and actually not just reading them, but doing Lectio Divina on it to try and get the perspective from which it is being generated, and not just grasp the propositions. So I'm really looking forward to opening this up. I'm just wondering if, like, not to diminish Maximus's metaphysical point, because I think the point you just made is a really important one. But I mean, isn't this in one sense the framework that is presupposed as being active, at least in principle, in every ritual, that the ritual is not a unique event, even though it might be super salient and in a special space and place, but it should transfer and open up all of reality in a profound way. And I think ritual knowing, I don't think it's another P, by the way, but I think ritual knowing discloses that very, very powerfully. And again, I'm wondering what that means. I mean, what happens? Sorry, and this isn't trying to pin anybody. We're trying to cooperate here. I'll get into dialogue.
It's okay.
No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So for me, I wrestle around the particularism, universalism issue, first, like you do, epistemically, metaphysically, but of course it also bumps us up against the pluralism argument in general, which is, I'm wondering, like, I mean, I wrestle with it epistemically, but I imagine that the three of you have to wrestle with it more profoundly, and I'm wondering, I want to hear how that shows up. Because Jordan, maybe I'll ask you, and this is an open question. Again, I'm not trying to do semantic martial arts, right? Right. Given what you just said on behalf of Maximus, and I agree that that's what he's saying, at least as far as I can understand him. You're an authority, I'm not. But right, how does that bump up against, I think it's fair to say there's been a long-standing tradition as regarding this as an exclusive event that demonstrates the exclusivity and the supremacy of Christianity or something like that. Well, look, here's Jesus. He's like, here's the greatest of the prophets. He's superseding them. Only this, like, I mean, I don't think
and God speaks, right? This is my beloved son.
Yes, exactly.
That's an instance of uniqueness. Yeah.
So I'm putting it before you. There's obviously a tradition that does what I've been saying, and Sam, thank for that. Sam has been, you've got that, and then you've got what you've just said, and I think you're being sincere when you say you're agreeing with me and that Maximus. Like, how do you understand the question? How does that sit with you? How do you wrestle with that tension?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's certainly at the heart, I think, of, I would think, not only my own wrestling, but perhaps well, certainly in a way that is particular to my biography, which, John, I've been listening to. I actually only heard about you through, I think, Nate and some other fellow travelers. It was like 2 months ago. So I've been doing my best while being a stay-at-home dad and doing dishes to have you blaring in the background. So, which you have
It transfigures the experience.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was
listen
gonna say
to John in the background.
I was gonna say he's made dishes super salient to me. So so
He
actually,
does the same for my redaction.
so first, yeah, word of thanks about that. But yeah, so no, I love listening to, you know, all of the stuff you're doing, the dialogues you're doing, and then this community is doing, because this, to me, it does seem to me the question you're raising is at the heart of kind of a lot of this. I mean, the very idea of dialogos seems to be that it's a recognition implicitly, at least, if not even sometimes explicitly, that yes, we all have our own perspectives. You can't avoid the particularity of your own perspectival approach to existence. So we're not doing that move, or it's like, well, somehow we can have access to something which is perspectiveless or without perspective. And yet at the same time, you know, it's a sort of a inherent conundrum, or if not just a straight contradiction, to say, I know for a fact that my perspective, or everyone's perspective, is simply that, a simple perspective, because that would be an absolute statement on perspectives. One way, so this is, so I can only just speak for myself. I think that there is something like a provisional necessity. So just say from the Christian perspective, I'm Catholic right now. I'm mostly sustained, though, however, spiritually and intellectually, through the Eastern Christian sources. There's something initially important, or provisional necessity, of seeing a uniqueness at all. Like, in a certain way, every religion, every great philosophical tradition has to recognize salience, right? Has to, and relevance at the same time, which is inherently bound up with a peculiarity or a particularity, or like, what about Socrates? Like, there's something about him, right? And your first episode I just listened to recently was great about that, and about the spirit. And is he really locked in history? Can we be after him? Right? In a different sense, a deeper sense. In fact, so much of what you said about the spirit of Socrates really reminded of the way that an influence on me in the Catholic world, Hans Roth von Balthasar, the way he reads text, and in Germanistics in the 19th or 20th century, that was actually that was thematized, that idea of looking for the spirit, not only in the folk, which obviously can go badly, but in the text, right? And in the another a luminary in history who's otherwise barred off from you by various dimensions. And so I really resonate with that. And so insofar as the Christian will look to, look at the event of the Transfiguration, and you see uniqueness, of course you see uniqueness, you have to begin there as a provisional necessity you have to distinguish this person from all others. Right. Because that's a part of recognition as well. And there's something in that, I think, even in our experience of love and so forth, there's something important in provisional necessity at the very beginning, to recognize them as distinct from everyone else. You're not just anyone else, right? You're my beloved. And so now the question will become, and I've already snuck it in, does this provisional necessity, like this necessity of the moment of recognition of uniqueness, does that necessarily hold the exact same form all the way out to what you might call the perfection, or the greatest insight into all things? That's really an abstract way to put it. Let me try a different way. I'll say, I do this a little bit at the end of the book. You'll see me wrestling with this very question at the end of the book. And of course, I'm sort of trying to fend off from in my own world. I definitely know people are going to be worried about what you might call the primacy or uniqueness of Christ, based on what I said, right?
Yes. And that's why I was hesitant about posing the question. I wanted to be very gentle about it. Yeah.
No, and it's okay, and it's a good one. Like it's one I asked myself, and so and I addressed it a few times in the book. But basically, one way that I put it is this: the person isn't simply the particular, but you can't recognize a person except through particularity. Exactly. Like, so there's that provisional necessity of, I need to distinguish you. The act of recognizing you is an act of distinguishing you. Now, I have not yet given significance, because I haven't given much thought to the nature of the distinction, you might say, right? What the separation, the not just like anyone else, like all these sort of phrases, like we haven't really, and often, at least in my world, I don't think people deeply think about that. And so one of the points I make at the end of the book, and I realize this, makes me sound a little Hegelian, and I more or less don't care anymore. I just sort of accept it. If Jesus's uniqueness is actually just an exception, like takes the form of being the exception to otherwise banal rules, that's really not unique at all. It's pretty understandable immediately. I know what an exception is immediately in the act of knowing what the rule is, and vice versa. When I state a law or a rule for a game or something, I'm already doing that in view of exceptions, which you might call breaking the rules. So actually, Jesus as unique simply as exception, to me, actually diminishes his true uniqueness as person. And so, yes, I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too. I'm trying to walk the balance here, but it's so I sort of simultaneously reject the natural and intuitive urges which begin in the provisional necessity of recognizing someone as a unique person. Like they begin there, and so they have an initial use, actually a necessity even. But just because they're provisionally necessary doesn't mean they're ultimately formally the way things are. Like that character of the provisional necessity carries all the way to the end of the ultimate necessity. And so I'm trying to push against either simply reducing, and I'm going to put it that way, reducing Christ to either an exception or a simple rule of all things. Because both of those are, in fact, in my opinion, now here I'll jump ahead to my dogmatic ways, they would actually diminish his divinity. Because those are just two finite, mutually conditioned conceptions that you subject him to and say he has to be one or the other. That is a limit. He has to be one or the other. So, and now, so people will get uncomfortable. You'll be like, well, okay, so what are you saying? Or what's your opinion about other religions, other paths, other ways, other? And I'm saying, why would I have a theory about that? It's as absurd as thinking I have a theory about a person I've never met or have met, actually, and I'm still getting to know. Or there's no way to encapsulate that kind of experience and that kind of relation with a person with some theory which you could recognize wholly apart from the experience of knowing the person about which I theorize. And so I don't want to do that to Jesus. That's sort of I know that might sound like a little bit of a squirmy position, but that's where I'm coming from.
I don't think it's squirmy. I've never heard that word before, but it's a good one. Let me say where it's resonating with me. In case there's some implicit convergence that we could further explicate. See, I mean, this is very analogous, and maybe it's stronger than analogous, of the problem of absurdity. The problem of absurdity is exactly the problem between a first-person perspective that is inherently meaningful to me and a third-person perspective in which all of that is irrelevant because the cause, this is Nagel's, and it's actually somebody declaring their love, and then it turns out it's just a voice recording machine, and right. And so the clash between his first-person perspective in which he loves Susan and the impersonal third-person perspective of a machine merely recording his utterance, right, is what makes it absurd. And then Nagel says, take that sort of everyday, somewhat humorous, and then you just blow it up and you get cosmic absurdity, this clash between them. And you can see D.C. Schindler wrestling with this in the Critique of Impure Reason, where he's, the absolute has to include the relative or it's not an absolute, but he doesn't mean that in just some simple Hegelian move. He's trying to say, no, because I think this is ultimately, and this is also Nagel's point, you can't resolve absurdity propositionally. You just state the propositions and then they just clash. You have to do something. I mean, so if you'll allow me, in the Buddhist tradition, right, you get like prajna or Spinoza, you get scientia intuitiva, in which you get a perspective that, right, discloses the interpenetration between the third person and the first person. It's some variation on like the second person perspective, right? And so you're nodding, and I'm hoping that means that it sounds like what I'm talking about is actually resonating with what you've just been proposing. Am I reading you correctly? Am I understanding?
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
What comes to mind, just real quick, just a quick comment. What I'll
Please.
focus on in the book is both Cyril of Alexandria and Maximus will at one point not only deny Jesus is a genus, but actually also deny that he's an individual.
Yeah. Which
because again, right, individual as instance of genus, kind, already implies this, if more or less, dialectical relationship between the two, which neither of which is sufficient.
But isn't that true of persons in general, though, Jordan?
Yeah, I think
is individual a proper way to understand what a person is at all?
No. And here's what I think is, but this is, you have to first, in order to understand a person, you have to see them as an individual. But we often deceive ourselves, in my opinion at least, we often deceive ourselves into thinking what I once needed in order to accomplish the act of recognition must be totally and absolutely I'm lacking a word here. I keep lacking a word here. What I once needed must always be what I need in order to continue to progress in knowing and various degrees of knowing, right? I needed first, in order to just like, so my wife.
No, but that's to confuse indispensability with necessity.
There we go.
Indispensability is,
there we go.
Right, I need it,
yeah,
but I don't need it forever. Necessity is I need it forever. And there's a big difference between those two. Is that fair? Is that fair?
That's super helpful. Yeah, I mean, it's like I needed a word like you gave it to me. Yeah, perfect. Indispensability is not necessity, and certainly not absolute necessity, right?
That's right.
Or you might say what's indispensable is absolutely necessary for a given moment.
Exactly. That's another way of putting it. Yes, fair.
Yeah. So I agree, Nate. I think it is, and in fact, in an article I read published elsewhere, I tried to argue that out of all these really otherwise like in the weeds Christological debates and fights, and there's always politics and so forth, one of the good things I think we could get out of that whole tradition through all the way through the 6th, 7th century Christological debates is that by the time you get to the end of them, what was at one point just an analogy they like to make between, like, say, Christ as a divine and human nature, and they're united as person in the way that you're sort of like the way your soul and body are united as you. That was common, and it's interesting to trace the uses because, of course, both sides use it, but for totally different reasons. By the time you get to Maximus and what I call the Neo-Chalcedonian strand of that tradition, I don't call it that. I accept that from scholarship earlier. Is they're actually making not just an analogy, but a direct comparison. An analogy would imply some sort of dissimilarity, right? And similarity, and you want the similarity to be the salient or the dissimilarity depending on your goal. But what they want to do is say, actually, Maximus says, in fact, it differs in no way whatsoever. The exact way that your body and your soul, however you conceptualize them or think of them metaphysically or whatever, the exact way that they are both distinguished enough in order for you to talk about them separately, but also only ever really one, namely as you, is exactly the same way that Christ can be said to have two natures in and as his one person. So there's not even an analogy for Maximus anymore. It really is strictly the same thing going on. So it just goes to your point, Nate, that I think you can say, in fact, this is true of all persons as well. So sorry, I think we derailed John, though.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I want to pick up on that. I want to ask Nate a question, but if Nate will allow me also to say something that after, and then I'll give a space for him to answer the question. Is that okay?
Sure.
I mean, but is this again? Isn't this? I take it this is one of Heidegger's points. So the relationship between being and beings is not a taxonomic relationship. And if you try to understand it from the taxonomic framework, you are fundamentally lost. You've misframed it in a fundamental way. And then, is it because persons are the beings whose being is in question that they have this special role? Right, and it's not just that this applies to persons, but it's that persons are indispensable because they are the beings through which the question of the relationship between being and being is pronounced. That's my take on it.
Right.
But
Well, I'd say
before-
person only exists as a description of that relationship. Like that's
Oh.
what person is.
Okay. So you think a person, which relationship? I said two things, Nate. Which the relationship between being and beings? That's person. Oh, I see. So for you, it's not an essential feature of a person that they are an integration of a mind and a body.
No.
Okay. So then that was a presupposition. You've discharged for me, because of course most of the literature I move in considers a defining feature of persons that they are properly described as a unity of mind and body, and that's what distinguishes them from the things we treat as non-persons,
Well,
like
you-
tables
but
and
you-
chairs.
Right. Well, you have, I mean, well, certainly I can't think of it simply that way, because you have like the beings of the heavenly hierarchy are hypostatic entities that are not embodied. So it can't be, so the concept of person has to embrace things that are not just a union of mind and body.
So this is one thing, if I might jump in. This is what I try to call, like in the first chapter of the book, the positivity of person. And I'm kind of borrowing that from the say 19th century theology and philosophy on Persönlichkeit and those things. But positivity of the person means, at least from my perspective, that again, while it might be necessary to see a person, and if we want to speak metaphysically, we could say it might be necessary for a person to have the natural powers, the potencies, potential to think. Therefore, they need something like a soul or more like an intellectual soul to live. They also have a body. They need to be sustained, et cetera, et cetera. These are again necessary for perceiving a person. But who it is you perceive isn't reducible to any of that of the media by which you perceive them. And yet they don't exist anywhere else except as that person. So it isn't as if they're like clothes you can take on and put off and change. And they're not accidents either. So this is this weird conceptual triad then that at least through Christology has to be distinguished, right? I mean, Maximus is going to die, of course, because he taught that Christ had two wills. So how can one person have two wills? No longer can you equate will with person. So there's something even deeper than, say, the psychological, psychosomatic sort of, organism, because this organism, or this person actually, is that, has a human body soul, a rational soul, etc., embodied rational soul, but is also, sort of this bearer who is also consubstantial, or whatever word you want to use, with the Father and the Spirit, who's also God, the Creator. And so I think that where the Christological tradition comes to, although it's mostly been forgotten, it seems to me, by even a lot in the Christian tradition even today, is that there is no so this resonates with something you said earlier, but there is no resolving any positive contrary, sets of contrary or contradictories even, except as person, because person as such is at once positive, like it delivers content to be known, like you can know and be known. And it's not like knowing John is not the same. I mean, this isn't anything you don't know, but I'm just saying knowing John is not the same. It's knowing something real, something actual, which is, and everything I say next won't be sufficient, right? It's unique. He's got his own way. I can even turn John into an adjective and say this is like a John thing to say, or a John way to talk, and nobody knows what that means unless they know you. So they know something real. It even affects my language. I can even play with language in light of you, whatever it is that you are bringing to reality, which is not describable and yet is therefore not negative either. It's not simply nothing, and it's not even a vacuum, right? It's not. So that's the positivity of person, which does seem to want person to be more than, like, say, Boethius's, individual of a rational nature, or something like that, right?
I get that. I get that, and I hear what Nate says, but here's I guess my challenge. When you say person and you do it as Maximus does, and it's the integration of a soul and a body, or I would say mind and body. I hope that's not problematic. And then he's really clear that they don't exist as species before the unity. I mean, I've been reading that passage over and over again.
Yeah.
And then I get, oh, wow, I can't, although I can abstract, and here I'm going to do like Merleau-Ponty, right? Although I can abstract mind and body from this, those are abstractions. The reality is about their complete interpenetration and interaffordance. And so that, and then when you say something about, person gives me some insight into reality, I find that meaningful. But, and then if you say, oh no, but I don't bind person to mind and body, then I lose the intelligibility that was given to me by that. And you're right, I don't think it's an analogy. I think it's a direct comparison, and then I lose the intelligibility. And so, and of course, Nate, I'll let you respond to this.
Well, wait a minute. What if, okay. Can you have a concept of intelligibility independent of person?
I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm saying.
Well, you said if it's not tied, if you can't tie it to the unity of mind and body, then you lose the intelligibility.
I use the intelligibility of the example. Yes.
Oh, you use it. Okay. I misunderstood you. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's what I said. I didn't say that. I wasn't generalizing. I was making about this specific point. Right.
Gotcha.
And then, right. And I have that on one hand. And then what I hear you, Jordan, saying, I should be phrasing this as a question. I'm being too aggressive. My question is, I hear that. And then I hear something that is, that sounds very, very similar, if not identical to, a Buddhist notion of suchness. The suchness of this is that about it, which is non-categorical, such that it is here now, and only it is here, all that, the suchness that can't be captured categorically. And then in that sense, everything has suchness, right? And we extend, we extend metaphors from, well, I'll say things like, that's a Tai Chi way of arguing, right? Which isn't attributing to a person. There's something unique about Tai Chi compared to all the other martial arts and all the other way in which and you can't get it any other way by doing Tai Chi. So I'll say strong things like, if you're not practicing Tai Chi Chuan, you're not really getting the Tao Te Ching, right? And I don't think those are superfluous claims. So on one hand, there's the suchness and the moreness of everything that are in tension. This is like Harmon's don't undermine, don't overmine. And then I have this idea of person as a category that tells me something about the relationship between things that are mentally categorized and things that are physically categorized. It's like, in the end, we shouldn't be thinking them as separable things, but as completely interpenetrating, interaffording. So, sorry, I took a lot of time, but I was trying to
that's good.
Put out what I'm saying here.
No, that's good. I've got two things to sort of like, just two things come to mind as you're saying.
I think we're actually talking about participation. We haven't even.
Exactly. I knew that would happen.
you little sneaky devil. No, that's great. And here's a, and hey, this could just be like an ambiguity in my own thinking for sure. But it's interesting because like everything you said, John, there, I was like, I agree with all that. And there's two things that come to mind that actually resonate. One is that really, I guess one thing I keep coming back to is how easy it is to abstract and how necessary, provisionally, indispensable, we'll say.
Yes,
right? It is. And that's, and I have sometimes people will come back to me in my world and be like, why do you hate abstractions? Like, well, I don't abstractly hate abstraction. That doesn't make sense, right? So, I don't. And in fact, I don't.
I'm enjoying your sense of humor. It's really good.
Good, because my daughters don't. They don't.
They don't yet.
They don't yet.
But that's just kids and the parents. That doesn't say anything important.
Yeah. Well, now I have an authority to wield that. My
kids are grown up, so once they become adults, They get back, you get this moment where they get the twinkling in their eye and you realize they're thinking, hey, maybe dad isn't an idiot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. My kids are 22 and 27. I get that all the time.
Yeah, John, but now I get to say, excuse me, a cognitive scientist said my humor is actually good. So there's something wrong with you cognitively if you don't see this. No, so two things come to mind. One is that right, judgments of exception, uniqueness, difference, just individuality or something, or suchness, or what maybe John Duns Scotus would call hechetas, thisness, thatness. These are relative as well, of course, right? They are this rather than any other this, or rather than something generic, or rather than a concept. And there's something inherently risky about trying to talk about person. And I make this shift in the first chapter, although I don't think I made it very clearly enough. Earlier scholarship tried to talk about, looking for the definition of hypostasis or hypostasis or person, in all these writers or thinkers. I think that's an inherently impossible task, because that which is defined, or even if you just think of person as subject, you're always saying, this is an old point by Aristotle and Porphyry make, you always speak more generally than that about which you speak.
You have to.
You have to. That's predication, right?
Yeah.
Subject, verb, object, whatever it is. So, which is also why you can easily start to think of subjects as mere instances of the genus that you predicate, or the accidental.
Yes,
right,
yes.
the universal you predicate. This. Right. And so there you get so there's a possible latent interpretation, which some did take up, even in the Platonic tradition, Neoplatonic tradition. I don't know if all of them did, and I think Proclus seems to have broken through on this score. But say like Simplicius or Syrianus, they would sort of say, well, yeah, and so individuals aren't even known by the divine intellect. Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing there to know. What's there to know is that about which the upokemenon, right, the subject, sort of carries. The subject itself isn't really anything, or maybe Aristotle's right, and it's just sort of some configuration of matter or whatever, and there's different bundle of properties, says Porphyry. Whatever it is, it isn't there. It's nothing permanent. It's only sort of like a brief carrier of the predicates that can be, etc. Which means that God doesn't know individuals, and that's not a problem or a lack, or God, I should say, the divine mind doesn't know individual. It's not a problem or lack, because there's nothing there to know finally. That would be one way of eliding, like interpreting the built-in fact of predication or abstraction, that A, you must abstract, or else how we could get this plane off the ground at all. But B, then equating the result, as it were, of judgments like that with the subject in a relation of instance of, right? Yeah. And so that is there. And I think even if you get to someone like Scotus, or you get to the suchness in the other traditions, or you get to sometimes the way hypostasis seems to work in some writers of the Christian tradition, you get a little breakthrough, because you get a registering of the fact that, well, hold on a second, there's something positive that's being added to me knowing this cup, this, rather than any other, right? But here again, there's this sort of interesting potential risk, a pitfall, where we can sort of abstract or generalize the particular as such. Mm-hmm. So now we start to talk about particularity. Well, what is it like to be such? Well, such, of course, and even Scotus recognizes this when he says hechetas, he always calls it a semi-formal principle.
Your church Latin pronunciation was throwing me from.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's all right.
My Roman Catholic showing.
Yeah.
Thisness, right? He always calls it a semi-formal principle, because he's aware of the fact that speaking about it formally, predicating about it, trying to give definitions and differentiating what this thing is, a suchness, rather than the moreness or whatever, is already a way of slipping into formal, abstract, relatively abstract. I mean, relative to the thing about which you want to speak, it's already sort of a moving beyond it, which is necessary. It's indispensable. So you can't really resist that, but you can recognize it or not, and then decide how to interpret the fact that you have to keep moving away from that about which you think and speak. And so he calls it semi-formal principle. Karl Rahner, by the way, just one last little citation, and just to prove that I, to all my all the billions of people that listen to me out there, that I really am a Roman Catholic. Sorry, I'm being a little too. So even Rahner makes this point in his little Trinity book, which is excellent, where he says there is no such thing as a definition of the three persons. And yet you're always speaking about the person as, say, opposed to the divine nature or whatever, right? And so we're setting a trap for ourselves from the very start, because you want something to register the positivity of, say, the Son as in distinction from the Father. And yet, if you try to speak about the person, well, aren't they both persons? So however you describe the person in a formal way would seem to need to apply to the two persons, Father and Son. In other words, it's a commonality, it's a common trait or feature or property. But the very thing about what you're trying to speak is whatever separates them or distinguishes them, right? So that's a real puzzle. And so, so the last point I just want to make there is that this is where I'm holding out for what I want to call the positivity of person. Like, I can speak of a person as the unity of the body and soul, or the unifying principle of the psychosomatic organism, or something like that. But I haven't said anything about my wife.
Right.
And if I know my wife, do I know anything more than psychosomatic unity? And I think yes.
Yes.
And so the question is, well, what is it that I'm knowing when I know her? Who is it? What is it? I don't know how to even to phrase it.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan, but the reason you have to make that move to talk about it in terms of this kind of positivity is you also can't reduce whatever that is to simply just a bundle of qualia either. So
it's who has the qualia now. Now we're speaking again of the perspective, not just the perspectival, but that she who has the perspective, right? Whose perspective it is. And that's so. The person, in my understanding, and John, I'll finally shut up so you can actually clarify things for us. Like, the person constantly makes him or herself known in even the way we think and predicate, but because they're so, as it were, canonically self-effacing, they can't be conceptualized. And so they're very quickly left out. The positive content delivered by the who of whomever I know is quickly forgotten. And I'm not saying you're doing that or anything. I'm just saying, when we try to go to speak about suchness or haechetas or a principle of hypostasis or any of that stuff, really, we're not talking about anyone in particular, but it was the person themselves which first gave rise to the whole line of thinking to try to capture what is it that I'm knowing when I know her. Right. And so this is where I see the wheels are sort of the cycle sort of turning. And
anyway, there's a way in which this only happens to this, and this I think John will like this. This only happens through something like dialogos, because we actually are only known through each other. We make each other known. Like, you can't. There's a way in which you can't ever be known to yourself, and you are only known in relation to another person.
Yeah, I just real quick, and then we should kick it to John. I've been working on this essay on Eriugena, John Scotus Eriugena, 9th century Irish philosopher and excellent thinker, and he actually makes the claim.
One of my favorite, by the way.
Oh, okay, awesome, okay, good. So here we are. So we got a common tributary here, right? And Eriugena has that argument that actually angels and human beings make each other, because
Bulgakov repeats the same idea.
He does.
Yeah.
It's not just right. It's not just the act of knowing, which is sort of, again, a formal perfection of the rational nature, conceptualized exactly as that, a rational nature. Whose, though? Where's the event? Where's the act of knowing, which isn't? No act of knowing is simply formal, because someone who is not formal is doing the acting.
Well, and also this,
right? So,
if knowing persons is like this kicks us right back to the Trinity and to perichoresis.
Right, and so exactly. So ultimately, where that line will go is that this is not maybe not even a reflection, but in fact a dawning or an emergence with it. I mean, this is a big claim, but of what we typically want to reduce persons to uniquenesses, to exceptions, to individuals, to particularities, to a bundle of particularities, to whatever it is that, and there's lots of ways to do that. A principle of Chaetos or something like that, of which they're what, again, an instance? Are you an instance of that, of instantiality? I don't know. So, and so, but Eriugenes, I think, deep point, which he's getting from others, but he's putting it together, I think, in a particularly coherent way that's just picked up later, is the 1 Corinthians 13:12. I will know even as I am known.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't just mean I need another to, it means that there is a kind of knowing. And I know, John, I think here we will resonate, but maybe I shouldn't be a little, overly eager. I've only listened to like half of the Awakening the Meaning Crisis.
That's a great thing.
That's 25 episodes. That's no small feat.
I do a lot of dishes.
Yeah, even still.
No, it's yeah. I also listen to him when I was doing laundry, so there you go. But it's a kind of knowing that can't be reproduced in any other way. And even the way I'm speaking about it is as if it were a principle or a generic or a genus or a way of knowing, a kind. It isn't even just that, because even my act of knowing another person, it's not simply an instance of intersubjective or transsubjective knowing, it is an event of it.
Mm.
And that isn't reproducible between me and Nate, between me and John and Nate. And there's literally, I don't even think there's a cap, there's an infinity of ways this could be realized. And so that's where, so with Eriugenes' point there is that even the angelic nature, insofar not just as it's rational, but that it's, I would say, now I am downloading some words here, intersubjective. I know even as I am known, and somehow knowing others does increase my self-knowledge, or at least it can, we should say. And increasing my self-knowledge, or it's exponential, it will also increase my capacity to know others well. And we might otherwise just call it, as Paul does in that chapter, love, right? And so love is the kind of knowing, which isn't really reducible in any of its actualities, its actual instances, to a kind at all. It's not a kind. Oh, it's a kind insofar as it's distinguished from other kinds, but it's that kind of knowing which is not in any actual instance, merely takes the form of kind or principle or form, right? So anyway, this is just it's another way to
tie us back to the Transfiguration, there's a lot of tradition that, like, for angels, knowing and seeing are a single unified act. There's no separation between knowing and seeing. They're a unified act. And this seems to be another way of understanding what's going on in the Transfiguration. The reason the disciples know that it is Moses and Elijah standing there with the transfigured Lord is because the knowing and seeing are one act. This is what this is the way Tomberg describes intuition or mystical knowing.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if you had a video camera there, it's perfectly
it wouldn't
possible
necessarily
to see,
capture anything strange.
Anything.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm curious what John has to say about knowing yourself, because I know that's a rather important phrase for John. And so I wonder how knowing yourself relates to being known through and by others.
And how it relates to person, John, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, these are all questions, of course, that I think Socrates made prominent and foregrounded in a really important way. I mean, he makes the proposal that we know ourselves only deeply through other people and how those other people are knowing us, dialogos. And I think that's, I think that that reference is correct. I think I want to try first at the metaphysics again, if we can.
Okay.
And of course I'll fail. But I want to say a few things that are maybe helpful, that are indirect, and then try to build on them. We have tried, and part of my argument is we're destined to fail, to try to capture relevance with the machinery of truth, logic, predication, and we are doomed to fail. And for lots of arguments that I've given, I'm not going to repeat those arguments. In the same way, people have made the argument, we try to somehow think we can get the existential quantifier to be the same thing as a predicate, and it can't be, because you get into this weird infinite regress. And so we keep failing, and we keep trying, because we understand that there's some deep interpenetration. There's some kind of unity between truth and relevance, but it's not identity. And this is the thing we keep, I think, sort of bashing up against here. And for me, that says something deep about their functionality. I'm not going to resolve that, because to resolve it would be to deny it. And that would just be a performative contradiction. But the fact that they are bound but not identical, even though that sounds like a contradiction, is precisely how they can mutually correct each other. Right? If you could reduce one to the other, then the capacity for truth to challenge relevance and relevance to challenge truth would go away. So I think we're bumping up against a fundamental, maybe even primordial functionality of intelligibility, and we're trying to resolve it. And I think we're doomed to fail at resolving it. And I think there's something about, you see similar attempts that people, and Russell banged up against this, people trying to get demonstrative reference captured by categorical reference, and it keeps failing, because you need demonstrative reference to be non-categorical in order to gather your things together to create your categories, right? And you keep bashing into these kinds of things. And and I'm not copping out. I've given arguments as to why I think that is the case. That they are interpenetrating, they're bound together, maybe like the soul and the body, that they're bound together and interpenetrating, but one is not reducible to the other, and that is as far as we can go, because if we try to step beyond that, we step beyond the fundamental thing that makes them functional. And I think when we do that, we realize that the functionality is primary, such that intelligibility, like I try to talk about this, when I'm confronting a person, or if I'm confronting something from the being mode and not the categorical having mode, I am seeing that non-logical, non-predication, boundedness, togetherness between how it's shining into intelligibility and withdrawing into mystery. Because if I could get it to completely shine in, I would have done the collapse. And if it just withdraws, I would have done the other kind of collapse, right? And so for me, and maybe this is what you're trying to get at, Nate, when you were sort of talking about person as a more, ontological, expansive notion, this notion that is, I think, for me, but for me, that's just fundamental to intelligibility. And so there's that. And then intelligibility has the same weird non-logical identity with realness. And if we accept that the non-logical identities are integral to their functionality, then the attempts to resolve them are actually fundamentally misplaced. Did that make any sense as an argument?
Yeah, that made total sense to me. And I actually think that aligns very much with the argument that Jordan is making in his book, although he's using different language to describe it.
Yeah, you go ahead, John.
Well, great. That's good. It means we have a lot we can talk about. But for me, and maybe there's a way through this around. I think the Greek notion of logos came the closest to trying to capture what I was just talking about. And
now we've talked about all three.
Yeah, right.
I knew we'd get there.
Part of what the Christian mythology, and you all know that I don't use mythology in a derogatory sense. Part of the Christian mythology is to try and demonstratively refer to that aspect of the logos that cannot be captured by logic, I think, in a really, really powerful way. I think that's important. And I try to respect that properly in these conversations. I hope you all feel that or recognize that. And so, but for me, I guess, again, this is where I want to say, is that not just a, is that not just sort of a fundamental feature of, I'm looking for a category that it's the fundamental feature that lies below ethics as a norm, as normativity, not just as how to treat persons, that underlies, like, that's deeper than the metaphysics, the epistemology, and the ethics. It's at that sort of space of intelligibility, and therefore, should it be bound to any particular metaphysical system, metaphysical claim?
Well, I have to have the capacity to somehow see you as a person before there can be any possibility of ethics, right? I have to
Yeah,
have.
and I'm not. I'm saying that, but
Yeah,
I'm saying,
I know. That's I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
John, it seems to me like you're making a metaphysical claim by saying that, and that you are talking about metaphysics by trying to make that point. I don't think you're doing something other than metaphysics that metaphysics is apart from by trying to talk about that relationship.
So is that an argument? See, what I want to do is I want to do a jujitsu move on you and say, but of course, what you just said is ultimately an ethical thing, Sam, because you're making a normative judgment about how we should prioritize our conception. And then somebody is going to say, but of course, isn't that ethical judgment dependent on no? And then we're just going to, and that's what I'm trying to resist. I'm trying to recognize this mutual arguability between each one of them. So no one of them it has that kind of prioritization, and I'm trying to get below it by recognizing that interpenetration. Did that answer your point, or at least
yeah?
respond?
But it sounds like you're saying something. There's something deeper than metaphysics and ethics and
Epistemology,
and epistemology.
Yes.
That is somehow uniting them together.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And to me, I thought that that's what the word metaphysics is supposed to be talking about, is how those things unite together. But what is metaphysics then that's uniting it with?
Well, Sam, you know what I would say? I would tell you, I would tell you that is best described as the triune God whose essence is love.
I know,
like that's what that's
of course,
talking about.
Of course you would, Nate. Your point's well taken.
Well, I would answer it, Sam, about that. The project, I mean, you see this project as dominating philosophy after the collapse of absolute idealism is exactly this project, which is like, and I get your point. A lot of times there's performative contradiction in it, but Heidegger and Wittgenstein, two prominent examples, are trying to do exactly. They're trying to do philosophy as exactly what I'm talking about here. And then that's what makes them, the sort of prominent figures. I have lots of criticisms of both of them. I'm not just saying, hey, there's the truth. But the point is, there's a project there, and I think that's the project that we should be wrestling with. I think one of the failings of postmodernity is that it has misconceptualized that project as a rejection of the three rather than triangulating through them in a profound way. But that's another thing. But I'm just trying to point to what the project might look like, Sam, in answer to your question.
Okay.
And I consider myself, in whatever twisted fashion, within that project. 4E Cog Psi is deeply influenced by both of those figures in really, really profound ways.
So,
all right. I while Jordan and John are in the same place, I feel like the topic that Nate originally proposed is one that I'm still very excited to hear you both talk about. And as far as I can tell, one of the central theses of Jordan's book is that Maximus goes beyond mere participation in talking about the unity and talking about Jesus's participation in the divine, right? And that mere Platonic participation is not an adequate way of talking about the relationship between divine and the person of Jesus. And I come from a very anti-Chalcedonian tradition, and that a part of me is like, what was wrong with mere participation? I felt like that had a lot fewer problems. And I know that John, the last thing John wants to be involved in is Christological disputes in Christianity.
But he might be perfect for it for that very reason.
But if there are genuinely limits to the logic of participation in terms of describing reality, that would be very much be of interest of John. So it could still be a productive conversation anyway.
And I'm also curious about how John would think about the Neoplatonic tradition of divinization, theosis, and that sort of thing. because
exactly.
because that, you know, that's a pretty big topic that Plotinus, Proclus, and all of them care about. And for me, my understanding is that Jesus really just is a human who grows in participation with the divine, and sort of like, you know, step by step, like, you know, the baptism was a big deal, all of his trials and temptations were a big deal, and then like finally kind of at the crucifixion and resurrection at the same time, there is this full participation of divinity where Jesus, in through moral cooperation and emptying himself, you know, brings the divine into union with the humanity in a final and exclusive and unique way. And that's very different than like the Chalcedonian idea, where by the second person of the Trinity voluntarily incarnating, it sort of like brings divinity into the created realm in a unique way, right? I guess my sort of thing is union at the crucifixion as opposed to union through the incarnation. But that's also very different than the Neoplatonic way, which, you know, I'm not trying to foist reincarnation on John, but, you know, a lot of the Neoplatonists had this idea of reincarnation and sort of successive growth into union with the one, seemingly in a way that basically dissolves the individual identity. I would say maybe that's true, maybe that's not. Whereas Christianity seems to keep the individual identity even after theosis by virtue of the resurrection and us having spiritual bodies. So I feel like those are three different kind of visions of humans' access and unity and participation with the divine. The Chalcedonian way, my sort of, you know, Unitarian Christology, and sort of the Neoplatonic, not Christology, that's not the right word, but whatever they would say is Christology without saying the word Christ. And so theosis.
Well, can I put some qualifiers on that, which I think have already been acknowledged? I mean, and it's not that there aren't Neoplatonists guilty of this, but if we're trying to get at the ratio of participation as opposed to just exegesis of what somebody said about it, I think that we have to acknowledge that participation, while present in taxonomic relations, is not identical to taxonomic relations. That moving up and down the taxonomy is not the same thing as disclosing the heart of what participation is. And so, I mean, and that I think that's important. You have to look at the relationship, I think, between the hypostases more directly to get a clearer picture of what is intended by the notions of participation, and then the idea that the taxonomic relations are images of that more primordial kind of relation. And then what you have is a very different kind of thing, which is some way to try and talk about, I mean, I'm sorry, and the one and the many. How is it that reality has these, again, they can't be logically identical, but they are bound together inseparably. And that's why I think we've been talking about participation all the way through. And I you know, if you read Damascus, for example, that upper register in the Platonic metaphysics, or whatever we want to call it, ontology, is where he's really focusing his attention. And I think there's a reason, because the tradition is consistently moving towards increasing emphasis on trying to get that. And I think Proclus is like, I think he makes a mistake in one sense, because he thinks that somehow if he just runs the taxonomic machinery more intensely, he'll somehow resolve this problem. And then there's other places where he doesn't do it. But I mean, there's innovation in Proclus, right? The notion of the one in us that has this non-logical identity to the one, which is a really interesting thing, because it's unclear how, like, is it that which makes you one as you, right? So what I'm trying to say here is, I'm not trying to dismiss Jordan's argument beforehand, but I do want to say that I think there are certain ways of representing the Neoplatonic notion of participation that are quite extant, but I think are relatively superficial if you don't take into account how much disagreement and argument and development is going on, which I think is a better way of trying to disclose the ratio of participation than trying to zero in on any particular proposition and say, oh, that's what participation means. I see the whole, I mean, I know I'll sound Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. I see that tradition as being the best way of trying to understand, and I carry that tradition into Erigena. I carry it into Nicholas of Cusa, right? And I see that trying to sense that whole development as the proper articulation of participation, not any one theorist or set of theorists. So I'll just lay my cards on my table. That's how I come at this. That's where I come from when I call myself a Neoplatonist. I don't say, everything that Plotinus says, yeah, right. That's not it.
Yeah, and to be fair to Jordan, the argument that he makes is specifically he's talking about an account of Neoplatonic participation.
Yeah,
yes.
I was going to make a few qualifications too before we move on. One is certainly, I had the benefit of studying under Father Gary Gertler, the great Plotinus scholar and translator at Boston College. Yeah. This is a point he would emphasize all the time as well. He would say, look. Just Neoplatonism is it's a marker in terms of it does distinguish, it seems like, say, between Ammonius or whatever in the 2nd century, although there's arguments about that now. There is something radical that does change with Plotinus, and so it's a useful marker, a scholarly convention in that way. But absolutely right. I mean, you can't it's hard to read Plotinus and then Porphyry's account, and then Iamblichus is on the mysteries of Egypt.
Yeah.
And think, now it is a tradition, as you say, right? Because I think it's brilliant. My understanding of Iamblichus is he's using exactly fundamental principles of Platinian metaphysics in order to argue for and ground theurgy and ritual.
Yeah, which makes a great argument for that, I think.
Exactly, yeah. And I took a lot of my inspiration from him, and then from the French scholarship on later Neoplatonism, especially like Jean Trouillard and Christian Guérard and some of those guys. But so certainly I think it's the case. And so in the book, so one of the things I would say is, and even in Maximus or certainly in Dionysius, you're going to get participation language. I don't know if I was clear enough about that. I think hopefully I was. It's been a while since I've looked at the book, but there is a banal sense of participation. I don't mean that as a negative judgment. It's the sense that we need to. It's not propositional. It is an event, is an action. There is a partaking in the sense that something common and shared is being I don't know if produced is the right word, or achieved, that does sort of get something from the participants, etc. And in that sense, there is no real problem. It's like that's not even precise enough to quibble with, like that, unless you're going to be extremely reductionist in some way. Mm-hmm. And so that is in Maximus. There's no denying that. He certainly does. It's just that actually the vagueness can become for him, like reading him or people in that tradition or Christological controversies, which does affect the way Eriugena takes up Maximus, who's a major authority for him.
Of course, yes, I acknowledge.
Yeah. And so in that sense, the basic sense, Cyril Alexandria says that, and he's the great single subject Christology guy, that the Neo-Chalcedonians, that's the other qualifier I would say. I'm not simply a Chalcedonian, I'm a Neo-Chalcedonian, because I don't think Chalcedon was sufficient in and of itself. And if it does anything, it sets the agenda for what has to be thought through and developed, rather than gives an answer that's clear. And so the Neo-Chalcedonians try to make a rapprochement between the Cyrilians, or the Miaphysites, those that want to focus on the identity, right, the one subject of Christ. But even Cyril will say, for example, that Christ partook of our divinity or our humanity. So that's a sort of vague notion that he has some intercourse with, right? There is an exchange of some kind. That sort of banal or basic or fundamental idea of participation, I don't think is negotiable in Maximus or anybody else in the broadly Christian Neoplatonist tradition either, which is why they can have these common sources. And
of course, it's why they can talk to each other.
It's why they can talk to each other. Exactly, yeah. And so, and there is, by the way, I did watch, I think part of, John, your response to another Jordan,
Jordan Cooper, yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and of course, Maximus would be, I think, more or less on your side on synergy, and so
Yeah.
it's cooperation, it's perichoresis. Why I really highlight that in the book is not only because Maximus really, in an innovative way, makes it kind of a crowning point of Christological reflection, that even in Christ there is an exchange. I mean, he says that he himself comprises the interval of his own extremes, his two parts, divine.
Yeah,
and human.
I've read that recently.
So it's Christ himself, as it were, is the principle of participation. And this is, by the way, something that Eriugena picks up, and this is maybe we'll get at, hopefully, back to Sam's, like where can we talk, where can we ask questions? Eriugena, in the third book of the Periphysion, he makes this really interesting argument, which has basically two steps. The first is that ex nihilo doesn't mean from something that's actually like a nothing that's really something, like a dark abyss or something.
Yeah.
The nihil is God.
Yeah.
So being created out of nothing is the super essential nothingness, which is
Maximus makes this point. I know Eriugena basically draws it, but Maximus makes this point. Is that what you're saying?
I think he does. I have to do a little work with certain texts, but he certainly says in ex deo, he certainly says all things are created from God, out of God. And then he also says out of nothing. So if you can just connect the dots and say, well, they must be the same. So Eriugena does that. But what's really crucial to see later in that the next step of that argument is why it is Eriugena's whole argument. And I think he gets this from Maximus. I'm writing an essay on this right now. That's why it's fresh on my mind. That I'm writing an essay that I think that Eriugena's idea that creation is God's self-creation is mostly a Maximian idea, not as much as,
that's going to get you in trouble, right?
Oh yeah, well, that's why I'm confined to this house and my children. I don't really have a place, but no, he has, I think he mainly gets it from Maximus, but the way that shows up in, say, the third book is that Eriugena does sense back to the one and the many thing, right? The same sorts of questions generating that whole tradition. He says, he basically makes the problem of the one and the many into the Christological problem of the communicatio idiomatum, right? The coincidence of opposites that Cusa will take up.
Yes.
Cusa studies Eriugena, as you well know, very, very meticulously.
Yes.
And so the coincidence, now to sense that you even need a coincidence of opposites seems to assume or presume that the opposites are worth reconciling. So now we have this bizarre thing where it seems like we're poised, as I sometimes have said, we're poised between two absolutes, which is obviously absurd. It seems obvious, at least at first. On the one hand, you have the absolute value of the one, the source from which all things come, etc., etc. But you also have something like love's attentiveness to the absolute value of all particularity and ultimately of all persons, which are not reducible to even their particular features because they're the bearers of them. And so Maximus Eriugena says, but he's presuming this, as I think it's already that kind of intuition that it's not, the problem isn't, I actually don't think there's a problem of, I think there's a problem only of one in the many is only a problem on the edges, as it were, of our thinking. Both why the procession at all, and so we got Plotinus in a few different texts saying, right, like as to why it comes forth at all, I stand baffled, I don't know, I'm all struck, and it's why this fall, why so great a fall. But then you also have the problem of return.
Yes.
Right. And the reason why this is the stress points, because we're back to the identity question. It's not just and I know that this is me affirming what you're saying, resonating with the problematic. It's not just whence or how the many from the one, but how can they both be absolutely valuable?
Yeah, that's well put.
And so Eriugena, he only reconciles this problem by positing the words, and it's not the Father, he's important about it's not the Spirit, the words self-creation in and as all things. Because the word alone is that subject that can bear contrary or even contradictory predicates.
Word is logos, is what you mean.
Word is logos, yeah. Verbum and for, but yeah, logos. So the word is that which makes it possible to even have aporia and find yourself at an impasse, because it's already the unity in the
Yes.
actual non-logical identity,
Yeah.
right, of these seemingly irreconcilable sets of predicates and that are, you know, that say pre-modern philosophy really writ large, which is really irresponsible of me, but hey, whatever.
Yeah.
And then say the postmodern swinging the other pendulum,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
say, you know,
yeah, yeah,
well,
yeah,
they're
yeah.
swinging between two absolutes.
I
and they
agree.
don't and so, but so that's where I think the Christological impulse goes, but it does require something like the recognition of the positivity of person, and not just person generically stated, but a person, an actual person. And he would call that the word, the logos, you know, and ultimately certain strands will call it that is the same as Christ, right? And so those are just some qualifications I wanted to say about participation. That I accept a basic definition of it. I have no problem with that. The question will become, I think, and maybe I'll throw this out there for discussion, from the Neo-Chalcedonian perspective, we don't say on this, from this perspective, that Christ was simply a participant in God, but he is that which makes participation possible. So that would imply a non-logical identity, which is the condition for the very possibility of any particular participation to occur.
And that would ground the same thing in all other persons through him.
Yeah, right. They're his body. Yeah.
So, well, there's two things about this. One is, I want to bring up that I think trying to take the notion of participation, and this is what Iamblichus introduces, and it's never rejected thereafter. Proclus, right. And even Dionysius uses theurgia. He just turns it into, you know, a Christian practice. The notion of participation is not fully captured by any propositional predication, and that only in the ritual knowing that is non-reducible to myth, drama, and proposition gives us more that is needed in our understanding of participation. So I first want to put that out, that when we're hearing the Neoplatonic, we have done this academic cleansing, right? You know, Dodds and Shaw's great thing was to say, no, that's a big mistake. When you try to pull all that magic and occult irrationality away and just look at, like, no, you're fundamentally misframing the Neoplatonic notion of participation.
Yes.
Like, so the way I participate in, like, you know, the Tao when I'm doing Tai Chi, I can't capture that but that is part of what I use to understand what the Neoplatonists are talking about when they're talking about participation. So that's the first thing. And I want therefore to wonder if you're actually saying something like that, because the notion of participation is like, it's the making possible of. And now I hear you wanting to say making possible the making possible of. And I'm not quite like, what's wrong? Sorry, and I don't mean this theologically.
It's okay if you do.
What's wrong?
It's unavoidable that you do, though.
I mean, what's wrong? Because I would say God fully participates in God, and the Neoplatonists are trying to say this when they have the nous completely thinking itself and knowing, but that's not the ultimate way of thinking about participation, because the nous also ultimately relies on something, right? The one, but that the closest we can get in thinking is to say something like that, and that's what the nous is. And then it's God is fully participating in God, and that's the first possible thought we can have, but it's actually not ultimate. And that's properly part of their notion of participation, because the nous, of course, is dependent on, right, that which is not in any way participated. Like, what's wrong with it, as long as you say, right, but the notion of participation has to push you beyond any any notion of one thing participating in another, because the way the intellect participates in the one is not the way the intellect participates in itself, yet they are not separable from each other. I'm sorry for sounding a little bit obscure, but did that the moves I'm trying to make sense there? Like,
Oh yeah, yeah. To me, yeah, no, that's and I think the question will become, if the basically the engine, in my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, the engine, both in Plotinus and then brilliantly brought back or used but extended downward towards ritual by Iamblichus and taken up by Proclus, is that which every act has to have a unifying principle, or else you wouldn't be able to even recognize it as an act.
That's right.
Right, at all. But that which unifies, insofar as, of course, it's real, because it's not going to be less real than that which it makes real. It's that which unifies cannot, therefore, it must in some sense transcend that which it unifies. The unifier, transcends that which is unified. And so you go up and up and up in scale, and then you can. Now, I think even in Plotinus, I think actually there's a recognition that this opens a new problem, though. And Plotinus brilliantly wrestles with it. Iamblichus brilliantly brings it in another direction. The problem is how to interpret the failure, as you say, inevitable failure to describe, because that failure is still a phenomenon.
Yes.
So then it cries out for, how do you understand what's appearing? My own failure appears to me. And now I have to understand how to make sense of that. And so there's different ways, at least it seems like they're not necessarily reconcilable ways. One would be to really double down on the apophaticism and say, there is nothing beyond, or that which is beyond, insofar as its mode is to transcend all that is currently apprehended. It may as well mean nothing to me. Because the moment it means something, I'm already beyond the one considered as such. And we might say, well, we don't want to consider it as such.
Yeah.
Well, but we've distinguished it, and even inseparability doesn't necessarily negate the need to interpret that which is inseparable if these things are really distinguishable, right? Nous infinitely contemplating itself and the ideas which it contemplates is its own perfection, and the fact that it has one power to intellect, but is perfected in the many and even perhaps infinite multiplicity of its own ideas, is itself its self-perfection. So it is the unity of the one and the many in its own self-contemplation. Except it got that power from somewhere.
Right, and it turns towards that.
Towards that, but the very failure, and this is where I like Plotinus a lot, the very failure to conceptualize the one is what generates the infinite number of ideas in the intellect itself. But the failure becomes the ground for the positive apprehension of intellect itself.
Yes.
So now we're interpreting the failure in a very specific way. We're saying that what you also can say, and I'm going to say it's the only way that's possible.
Okay.
I certainly
no, I'm hearing you. Go ahead.
If it's the case that intellect itself has already infinitely realized and intellected and known in its own self-realization, which isn't, of course, not a chronological thing, but it's a self-realization. It does have potency to act, and act, which is why Plotinus says it will always be, quote unquote, in a certain way too, dual, diplos. If that's true, then it means that the one is now being interpreted, and perhaps implicitly, as that which can never appear as real to intellect. It's only the condition for the possibility of everything else appearing real as intellect, and as intellect's own self-identity, with that which appears. So that's a sort of very negative. I think Damascus will go full hog on that.
Yes, he does. The ineffable.
Now I think there's another direction, as you well note, we've already mentioned. Iamblichus is brilliant because he wants to give it a positive interpretation.
Yes, and that's what I was trying to put my finger on.
Exactly. And Shaw's good with this, as you know.
Yeah.
It's actually another way to interpret it, and maybe they're not even, maybe someone would want to say they're not even irreconcilable, but of course, one beyond intellect looks quite a lot phenomenologically like below intellect.
Mm-hmm.
So the material, the incense, the ritual, the words you say, the way you move, the way the priest speaks, etc., these things that seem sub-intellectual might actually be perfectly functional as an access point to the supra-intellectual, precisely because you have to realize it's not going to come in the mode of intellect as such. And so he's using Platonian principles, which is
Yes.
brilliant, in order to return to the material as, quote, as he says, quote, the body of God. Bodies of the divine bodies, he says. And so that's all fine, and I like that, and it's good. And I think there's actually great grounds in Plotinus himself, specifically Aeneid 6:8, where even he has to change, and he self-consciously does, into a positive register. And he says, if I have to say anything about the one at all, and if I have to choose whether or not the one wills according to its essence or it wills its essence, so according to no essential principle, he chooses the latter.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a Platinian one in a sort of weirdly Barthian way. You have the Platinian one willing its own essence, which is nevertheless not essence at all, right? And so it's the emptiness from which fullness comes. So
Jordan, I
yeah.
have to ask you, how closely do you map logos to this conception of the nous? Because if you're saying that it's the nous's failure, in a sense, to grasp the one that sort of is the fecund failure that generates multiplicity out of the unity, then that would be saying that there was some sort of failure in the logos to comprehend either the Father or the divine essence or something like that in Christian terms.
Right. And
I'm not sure if that would fly.
No, I don't think it will. And actually a figure it won't fly in the Christian post-Nicene tradition, that's for sure. I think Christians prior to that played with it. And I think
Arius, well, that's what Arius's point. Yeah, exactly. Arius, this is exactly Arius's point, that the Son can't even know the Father fully.
Exactly. No,
Yeah.
that's right. And in a certain way, of course, that makes immediate sense. I mean, that's a coherent thing to say. That makes sense. Which we'll get to the heart of really what I want to say ultimately, but I just wanted to note a figure that's often not noted in this context. I think Marius Victorinus is an important figure here. He was a Neoplatonist in Rome. He converts around 354 and writes pro-Nicene anti-Arian treatises that are there and available, but people don't. Sorry, I've got a fly in here. And he makes this. He has the same problem that you just stated, right? Of course, if he's going to be anti-Arian, he can't admit that the logos as nous is in any way some sort of even apophatic failure, right?
Yeah.
And Marius does something interesting. He ends up doing, I think he picks up on that other strand in Neoplatonic tradition himself, which he knew very well, that another way to speak apophatically is positively. That's usually not, usually we're always doing supra and hyper and right above and transcends, but you can speak intentionally positively in a way that also reveals the apophatic. And that's his argument for for the Nicene Creed. The fact that you say that the Father and the Son are consubstantial and that doesn't make intellectual sense is itself the expression of the highest apophaticism. So Trinitarian theology, in his perspective, is the kind of perfection, and I know this is, I don't mean to, but is the perfection or the flowering of Neoplatonic impulses as much as it is anything else or whatever. So that's, we'll believe him. But anyway, so I think, and by the way, by the time you get to Maximus, who is very much obviously in the line of that the Logos is consubstantial with the Father, there's no division in that way. But of course, there's always that weird problem that the divine essence that they share is also super essential. And I think the way it's super essential is precisely as the three person. So now person, right, becomes, we're running up against person again. Because the mode of the absolute super essential essence just is the three, forever perichoretically interpenetrating as one. And in that sense, they achieve even. It's not a chronological movement from potency to act or anything like that, but in a sense, they are always achieving the essence as three mutually loving Father, Son, and Spirit. which would, so you could accept the Plotinus-Ennead 6-8 move to say the one in fact creates his own essence. If I must say anything at all, I may as well just say the will is prior to ousia itself in the one, which is exactly the opposite in the intellect. The ousia is there as the potential principle of knowing infinitely all the ideas that there is to know, and that's realized, and that is intellect, or logos, or nous. So I think, anyway, so I'm just, all that to say that Maximus interestingly starts to sound more Stoic in his cosmology, precisely because, like the Stoics, the logos is the highest divine, is God, and is in all things, and is the principle of the world, and right, etc. Obviously, they differ in other things, but it's just interesting to see how, so that all can sound really, whatever, you know, in the weeds and academic stuff. And you guys correct me if I'm wrong on some of that stuff, or my understanding of some of it. But I just want to point out this last thing, and then we can go on to what you guys have to say. I think the impulse, the through line, at least on the Christian side, is the absolute refusal to give up on either of the two absolutes. One and many ultimately are in no competition whatsoever. And then this is where Christian eschatology has to come in. And you have to say, and the end, by the way, which has already come upon us in the incarnation, according to the New Testament, the end has already come upon us. The end and the beginning are the middle, and none of it has to be canceled whatsoever. And somehow that all works in the logos, whose very act of entering into history as a historical figure makes the last bridge between the most particular, finite, seemingly delimited reality, just some guy in history, and the one who is the ground of all history and of all ages. So however, whether you think that's coherent or wrong or unnecessary or ridiculous, at the very least, I'm just highlighting the impulse behind it is a refusal to admit that either absolute is anything less than absolute, and therefore must be preserved through to the end. And that's where what I think is animating, say, someone like Ariugena.
It was a lot.
Sorry.
No. I mean, I was silent because it was good. I'm not saying it was a lot. It was bad because it was a lot. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
I don't think I'm sort of trying to select how I want to respond. There's a couple of things I guess I want to say, as I want to put a couple points together. The nous turns towards the one, and I don't think enough attention is given to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is its way of knowing the one. So if we give up the idea, which I've been arguing also, that comprehension means completion, means fully grasping, and then you take something like Spinoza's position that truth is only understood in transformation, that the turning of the one is the way that the intellect participatorily knows the one, right? Which is different from the non-temporal explication of the infinite relationship between all of the forms. It's a different act. Not that there's a division in the one, but one is the unfoldment of intelligibility. The other is intelligibility, right, depends on a capacity for self-transcendence, for non-completability, Gödel's theorem kind of thing. And that is the way in which there's a positive knowing of the one in that transformation. And of course, this is a Chomskyan point. Transformations of representations are not themselves representations.
Right.
They can't be, because then the system will stultify, it will ossify. You have to have something other than the representations for there to be the life within them. And I think the way from within its capacity as something living, which of course we're stretching here, the nous can turn towards the one, is the positivity. And I think part of what Iamblichus is saying, and I agree with you, there's the look at all these non-conceptual transformations that you can profoundly experience, and that I want you to understand without trying to capture it in a set of representations, that is, right, as you said, that's the way in which the intellect participates in the one. So if you look at knowing not just as comprehension, but as I'm using psychological analogies here, so please don't pin me to them. But if we remember that within understanding is not just coherence but insight, and insight is not itself a propositional process. I would say the intellect, and in fact, that the nous and noesis really correlates with ideas around insight, is also not a coincidence here. That the one knows, the intellect knows the one in something like an insight. But that doesn't mean that it can point to a conclusion. It's the turning, and that something is being disclosed beyond the self-containedness of the field of intelligibility that is a positive knowledge without it being any positive proposal about the one. And then we can experience that ritually through ritual knowing, through transformations that, as you said, do not properly fall within our theoretical frameworks or something like that. So I think there's resources there. Now, am I claiming Plotinus saw this? Yeah, it's like me. There's something there, and it comes into the text, but whether or not he explicated it like the way we're doing right now, I would hesitate to say that. And so I think part of what we're bumping up against, and this is a bit of a critique, is that there's notions of, again, we're talking about relevance with notions from truth, and we're talking about, because I think relevance realization is properly understood as something that is definitionally non-completable, and therefore we have to understand that in a kind of knowing that is not a knowing of completion or grasping, but a knowing that it only gives you a retrospective understanding of what you have transcended. This is Spinoza's point, right? Truth is its own standard. By that, like, the relevance takes you through the transcendence that allows you to see how you were misframing things. And that is a crucial thing of truth that is not capturable, again, in any kind of completion of the coherence of intelligibility. And so I think there's profound resources. Well, I aspire and hope that there are, because this is where I'm placing my bets. I'm thinking that as we deeply understand, intelligibility within us, it gives us some profound understand. I mean, this is the argument I made at Ralston, and it's the argument I made about Neoplatonism and levels of the self and levels of intelligibility. The fundamental grammar of cognition has to line up with the fundamental grammar of ontology, and I think we pay too much attention, right, to the representational structures, we would call it knowledge representation, and we fail to grasp the significance of the kind of knowing that is only in the transformational processes, the turning of the one, and that. So I don't see that, like, I don't see the one as the intellect is failing to grasp the one. I see the one as the intellect is failing to grasp the one as anything that can fit within the system of intelligibility.
Yeah, actually, that's well put, and it really again reminds me of Ariugena's God does not know God's self because there is no what there in God to know.
Right.
However, as you well put, that doesn't mean there's nothing to know.
That's right.
It just means that whatever is known isn't some sort of formal representational,
See, I know my partner as much as anything I can grasp about her in how she is ungraspable by me.
Exactly. At the same time.
Right. And
right.
Again, non-logically bound together.
Right. And so
I think that and love is the proper comportment for properly realizing that. I mean, this is I think the great insight, the metaxu nature of love in the symposium. Love is right. It's the grasping that always is opening to what can't be grasped, right?
And this is why. So the question, of course, we want to if you knowing the one, do you know someone? When you know the one.
Or is it a person?
That's another way to ask it, right? Yeah. And again, and I mean, not let's discard all the bad definitions or descriptions or understandings of person. I don't mean an individual necessarily. I don't mean just that person over there, although the way we know each other begins with that person over there. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that yet. And so that's always going to be, I mean, whether you go with Pascal's, dichotomy of God of the philosophers, God of the Bible, or God of, Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph. There's lots of caricatures there that run throughout, but there is something there that is still like a question. And the question still is, and it's one of the, how do I interpret the failure to perceive the one in these modes, right? Because the one's beyond all those modes. Nevertheless, is it because the one isn't knowable at all? That's Kant.
Yes.
Let's discard. I had to discard knowledge in order to make room for faith, right? So that's one way. All the post-Kantian idealists, well, a lot of them, are going to resist that in different ways. And then I think Sophiology and the Christian Orthodox world tries to do it another way, et cetera, et cetera. And then people retrieving Neoplatonism are trying to do it in still another way, and they have a lot in common. But the question that will persist is the one inaccessible by those modes because we know the one is beyond, and that's basically it? Or do we actually positively know that the one is beyond those modes because the one is a person? And persons are not accessible in those ways, and that's something we actually know as well if we reflect on it appropriately, even in our own experience here and now. That's the question. I'm just throwing it out there as, is that the wrong question? Is that the wrong framework? I don't know.
Let me see what I think I'm saying. And you said it has at least it was a plausible proposal. I'm trying to say the one is knowing in the beyonding, and the beyonding is not any settling into any one thing known.
Right.
And is there a beyonding in a person? Yes. And the cognitive instantiation of that is love. That's the argument I'm trying to make. And then so I would ask this question: is it possible to love the one?
Yes, exactly.
And what Plotinus is, I think he's clearly indicating something like that, although I'm putting later stuff back into him. So I might be.
Although that's what theosis would be loving the one, right? Wouldn't those be two ways of describing the same thing?
Yes. And so for me, and then for me, Jordan, I hope this, I'm not trying to make a cop-out here. For me, do I do rituals in which I properly experience loving the one? And my answer is yes. My answer is yes. And then if you can use, and if you, I don't know if there's any other way of answering a question of love other than that way. Now, maybe you think that as a cop-out, but that's how I try and respond to this.
Well, what I see is that you're taking love very seriously.
Yes.
So I actually think that brings us far closer than probably like, you and I are to other sorts and ways of thinking. This is a little anecdote, and it's just illustrative of what I'm getting at. I had a student back when I taught. I had a student who took my intro class. It was a Catholic school. She had to take this intro to theology class, and she was very respectful and awesome person. She was a Canadian, so there we go. But and she was, but she made it pretty well known. Like, I don't really need religion, and I don't need spirituality stuff. I got my own thing. I don't need to pray. She didn't even like the ecology of practices you talk about. She was one of those that was like, look, I'm agnostic. Maybe yes or no. I don't know. And so I was like, okay, we had good discussions, and we had discussions about whether it's possible to, be a traditionalist, or is that sort of its own tradition, etc. Right. And great student, really smart. Well, I heard from her about a year later, and she emailed me, and basically it was a really bizarre email. It was just sort of like, I need to talk to you. I was like, okay, like, sure. Yeah, here we go. And basically she came to my office, and she proceeded to tell me that past summer, her younger brother was diagnosed with cancer. He's like 17. And she's like, remember when I told you a year ago I didn't need God as person or anything like that. I was wrong. And I know that because the moment I learned that he had cancer, I wanted to pray and I didn't want to just speak to no one. So she was wanting in love. She wanted a beloved. And that's a positive thing. That's not nothing. That's nothing relative to things like concepts, ideas, definitions, but it's something that's so real and so positive that it initially looks like it's a negation of everything else, but actually it's an embrace of everything else. And that's the heart of person. And so anyway, we went on and had this discussion, but I was so fascinated, and I talked to her about it later. I was just like, and she's like, I don't know why I wanted that. I never thought I did. I didn't think I needed any like connection like that. And there's a million ways to interpret that. It's a single anecdote, but that's what I'm getting at. And what I'm hearing you say is that you do think that, like, you do believe that love is the sort of not just mode of knowing truth, but that maybe truth can speak. Maybe truth is also a person.
This is
right.
Oh, sorry.
Nope.
Right. I mean, this is why I say, and I've said it publicly many times, I prefer Christian Neoplatonism to pagan Neoplatonism precisely because of the integration of logos and agape. And I think
Okay.
we're exemplifying that right now in a profound way. And this is part of my general thing about, again, looking at the grammar of cognition, the attempt to separate rationality from affect is just totally misframing the reality of how cognition works. And I often say this, like, relevance realization is not and cannot be cold calculation, right? And there's all kinds of empirical, like the fifth E of 4E cognitive science should be emotion, broadly construed, right? And so, yeah, I think this is a recognition at sort of the height of our discourse of something that goes into the guts of how the mind actually works, the embodied mind actually works. And yeah, I've been arguing it very deeply, and that's why I don't like aspects of Neoplatonism that sort of cusp onto Gnosticism by being sort of antagonistic towards embodiment, as if it's some kind of imprisonment in some fundamental way, because I think that ultimately supports this kind of Cartesian separation, Cartesian romantic separation that we have to get beyond, because we're fundamentally misrepresenting the kind of beings we are with this kind of ontology. And I think that is deeply conducive to being seriously alienated from yourself in a way that contributes to the meaning crisis. I need to get going, gentlemen.
Oh yeah, we've gone over the time I had budgeted, and you've been very gracious as always, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, John. It's great to meet you.
Jordan, I mean, it's been like, I've been really taken by your thinking. I mean, you're brilliantly insightful, and I love the cognitive flexibility in your thought, and like I learned a lot from talking to you, and so I hope that was.
I knew you'd like him, John.
Well, yeah, of course, but I'm hoping that was conveyed along with, because sometimes I was challenging you and pushing you, but I hope
that's fine.
Yeah, I hope you're.
No, you're extremely gracious and generous and very, very brilliant. And even though I might not pick up everything you say while I'm doing the dishes, I've learned quite a lot, and I wish I'd known about you earlier. So we'll hopefully continue to talk, and I'll continue to.
I hope so too. And of course, Nate and Sam, it's really good seeing both of you again. I'm glad you were here, Sam. It helped to round things out, I think, in a really appropriate way.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to